Hello, my name is Tony Horgan. In this video, I'm going to read out an interview that I was asked to do in this magazine, Amiga Addict, issue 13. As I record this, it's on sale still for a few days towards the end of July 2022, I believe. I also think it's probably still available to buy online from the Amiga Addict website, so have a look at that. Okay, so I'm just going to read this out and maybe cut some visuals in and might jazz up the video in some way to make it a bit more interesting. And because I wrote this interview over email, so I thought it might be nice to read it out and bring it to life that way. So let's begin. I should say the reason that I was interviewed for this magazine is because I used to work on Commodore and Amiga magazines and was editor of CU Amiga in the UK. So without further ado, let's get this partly started and I shall start reading. So this was an interview that I did with Paul Monahan from Amiga Addict Magazine, and they have strapped me as CU Amiga legend. Not my words, the words of Amiga Addict Magazine. So that's nice. I'm not quite sure how to take that. So let's begin. The intro says writer, musician, editor, Paul catches up with a man who did it all. In this series of interviews from the magazine scene, we've covered quite a few people who wove a path through the rich tapestry of Amiga publishing. Tony Horgan is no exception, but he is surely best known for his time at CU Amiga. I caught up with him to see what his story was. So then there's a picture of me in my studio, which is this, where I am now. So the first question is, what were your earliest memories with computers and gaming? Well, I answer thus. The first computer we had in the house was a ZX81 in 1981. It belonged to my older brother Michael, but everything in our house was shared anyway. I was one of 4 brothers sharing the same bedroom, so sharing was a way of life. Michael taught me to program computers and set me on my way. I always loved arcade machines. In the late 70s and early 80s, they were everywhere. The fun fair would come to town with the old black and white games like Sprint. We'd go on holiday to North Wales every summer and other seaside towns during the school holidays. Arcades were a lure then. Some of them still had the mechanical machines like the shark game you see in the Jaws movie. Quick Save in Port Maddock had an Astrofighter in the entrance. Locally, the barber shop had Breakout, the chip shop cycled through Space Invaders, Battlezone and Missile Command, and the cafe at the park had Asteroids. Heathrow Airport had Mooncrester. Rub your foot on the nylon carpet to generate static, then touch the coin slot for a free credit. And the boys' club specialised in 2-player tabletops. The video shop near school had Donkey Kong. Other spots in Hounslow had those knockoff clones like versions of Donkey Kong that had the wrong colours and weird sound effects. I think I played virtually every coin up from the late 70s to the early 90s. Anyway, we continue. The next question is, during the mid-80s and beyond, we had the Spectrum versus Commodore 64 rivalry. Can you remember what you thought of all this? Well, the Spectrum was the logical next step from the ZX81, and in 1982 in the UK, that was the next big thing. Like the Spectrum, the Commodore 64 has a 1982 date on it, but in reality, the Spectrum was up against the VIC-20 at that point, in the UK at least. In 1982 and 1983, the Spectrum had a much better range of software and games than the C64, and it had a far superior version of BASIC. I could knock up a playable game on the Spectrum in 10 minutes. Make that half an hour if you wanted music and high-res graphics instead of ASCII characters for sprites. At that point in the UK, so we're talking about kind of 1982, 83, the Spectrum offered programmers and publishers an incredibly fast route to getting their software out there. In comparison, the Commodore 64 scene was quite slow moving. There was a just do it ethos about the Spectrum. By 1984 and into 85, a lot of that momentum from UK developers had transferred to the Commodore 64, and the best developers, such as Epix, had got a handle on the hardware too. That's when we switched to Commodore at home. At school there was a bit of rivalry, but we all just wanted to play the best games, really. To be honest, if you had a Spectrum or if you had a Commodore 64, you would swap games with whatever format. And if you had a friend who had a Spectrum and you had a Commodore 64, then you'd go to their house to play that, and they'd come to your house to play yours. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the rivalry was stronger with younger players. I don't know. I never really saw it that way. We all just wanted to play games, really. So the next question, being a musician yourself, the Commodore 64 had the excellent SID chip, the sound chip. Were there any particular tracks that stood out to you? So my answer is, predictably, I'm going to say Rob Hubbard. I still listen to the Kentilla soundtrack, a long-form, spooky, quite minimal track that played on a loop in the Mastertronic adventure game. Unless you were going to make very basic music with the Commodore 64, you had to be a skilled programmer too. Rob had that technical ability to create sounds that nobody else could, and he had the ability to transpose a wide range of existing musical styles into his own genre. If he'd done the music for a budget game, I'd buy it for the music alone, even if I knew the game was awful. I was frustrated that I didn't have the machine code abilities to unlock the potential of the SID at that time. There was an extended BASIC application released by Ocean called Laser Basic. There's a picture of it here in the magazine of the cover. Laser Basic. So there was this extended BASIC released by Ocean called Laser Basic that gave me a bit more control over the sound chip, but those Hubbard snare drums were still out of reach. Still, I made some fun games with Laser Basic. Getting back to the SID chip, I remember talking to the programmer of Mega Apocalypse, Simon Nicol, at the game's press launch in a hotel function room in 1987, and him telling me he'd managed to get a 3-channel Rob Hubbard soundtrack into the game and then add his own sampled sound effects over the top of that, using a virtual 4th channel, and the SID only had 3. He wouldn't tell me how he did it, but I've since figured it out. Okay, next question. In 1987, you began work on your first computing magazine, Commodore Computing International. How did this writing job come about? When I was 16, I'll read that again. I was 16 when I got that job. I'd been sending letters and reviews to magazine editors for about 2 years by then, so it was only a matter of time. I didn't like secondary school, and I didn't want to stay a moment longer than was necessary. This is going to make me sound very old, but I took typing as an exam subject, as I knew I wanted to be a writer. We learnt on huge mechanical typewriters. A regular exercise we did was to type along to a vinyl record on a turntable like this, for example. It wasn't really a Technics 1210, it was but it was a record player, and the vinyl record used rhythmic violin tones to keep the whole class in time. So it went doot 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 doot, Okay, and every time it did a doot doot, you would type a letter. So you would type Q Q W W E E R R T T, and then you would get to the end of the page, and the record would know, it knew how many letters you would have typed, and when the carriage that had the paper had got to the end, and then it would say on the record, "Carriage return," and the whole class would get the little lever on their typewriters and all slam it across to come down to the next line, like pressing enter on a keyboard or a computer. So you'd have like 20 or 30 kids in the class all going slam on their typewriters as this posh voice said, "Carriage return." Anyway, so that's how I learnt to type. So I knew enough about everything else, but still needed some good results in my maths, English and computer studies O-levels to be taken seriously by the grown-ups who were in charge of the jobs in the magazine industry, because, you know, grown-ups were in charge of everything. It was really frustrating for a 15, 16-year-old that grown-ups were in charge of everything. That's how I felt. CCI, Commodore Computing International, was the first magazine to offer me a job. The editor and boss of the company, Anthony Jacobson, sent me a game to review and then took me on as the only writer in the office. It was a very small outfit at first. They didn't even have a typewriter for me or any way to print or export anything I'd written from the Office Commodore 128D or the Amiga 1000. My first reviews were handwritten on a notepad and then typed up by Sandra Gallagher, the production controller, who had ownership of the Office typewriter. John Hare and Chris Yates of Sensible Software came to show me Whizball for the Commodore 64 on my second day in the job. This was before desktop publishing had really taken off. I played the games and wrote the reviews. I took the screenshots on a 35mm film camera through a tunnel of cardboard and coats, and then took the film to the developers down the road, collected the film later on that day, and then chose the screenshots that we should use, cut those frames from the roll of film, took those around the corner to the scanning company and waited for them to be scanned on a drum scanner. And the drum scanner was a big tube, not the microphone there, a big tube of glass which rotated, and you would cut out the transparency. So it was like a negative, but it was a colour, kind of like a colour negative, if you like, you know, a colour transparency. You would cut that out from the film and then stick it on with a kind of sellotape onto the drum, and then it would spin round, and then somehow, I'm not quite sure what happened after that, you would get this kind of blown up version of the screenshot in what they call colour separations. If it was for a colour page, it would be one piece of film for a black and white page. So for a colour page, we get 4 pieces of film that would be however big we wanted the screenshot to be on the page. So if the screenshot was going to come up to this size, we'd have 4 bits of film for that screenshot, about that size with a bit of overlap, which would be cyan, magenta, yellow and black, even though they would all actually look like kind of black and white negatives. And if it was black and white, we'd just have one. So that's what I would do. Then I would bring those scans back, the films back, give them to the paste-up artist, for example, Graham Baldock. I doubt very much Graham Baldock is watching this, but Graham Baldock or Rico Gusman maybe, who would create the pages by literally cutting and pasting text and pictures onto a piece of card. So I learnt a lot about the process and worked very long hours for very little money, but it was fun. I'm going to pause now to stop recording and record a new session in case this all fails. Okay, next question. Around this time, the ST and Amiga were still early in their lifespans. Being interested in music, how did you find these new machines and their capabilities? So I answer. In the office we had an Amiga 1000, but Atari had already released the more affordable 520 ST-FM, which I had at home. It took a while for the Amiga to develop as a music machine. Early official software was pretty tedious, but when the trackers came along, the sampling potential of the pool chip began to shine. For me, the ST was a games machine, but the Amiga was the music machine. In the 80s, I loved the music that was being made with pro-level samplers such as the Fairlight CMI and EMU emulator, so the Amiga sampling abilities were a real treat. While we're talking about that early era, I'll just flick you over to my Amiga here, which I have set up running Marble Madness. Marble Madness was one of the first games that I saw running on an Amiga. It was out in 1986, so when I started at Amiga User International, it was still quite new, and it was a very quick turnaround from the coin-up, because I think the coin-up is 1984, so it was still quite cutting-edge stuff. So I've put this on a cheat mode, just so that I could leave it here running while I'm talking to you. I'm just going to try and finish this. There we go. I loved the it was very accurate. I loved the original, the arcade original, with the trackball. It's very original, and I liked the way that the Amiga version used the mouse, which was a new kind of input method at the time. It used the mouse to give you that kind of rolling analog, multi-directional rolling control, rather than forcing you to use a joystick. So you could use a joystick if you wanted to. I haven't got the sound plumbed into the mixer at the moment, otherwise you'd hear some nice FM sounds. Anyway, I am veering off track slightly, so I just wanted to show you that as I had it set up, and I've put in the work to set that up, so I may as well show you that rather than just cut that in. So where were we? Yes, so the next question is, you also worked on Amiga User International before joining EMAP. EMAP was the publisher of CU Amiga. Did Amiga User International differ in any way to Commodore Computing International, or was it just a case of the Amiga becoming more popular by the late 80s? So I answer, Amiga User International was a sister publication to Commodore Computing International. So in the same way that Amiga Addict and Pixel Addict would be considered sister publications. I don't know why they give them that kind of, why they call them sisters rather than anything else, but there you go. So Amiga User International began as Commodore Business and Amiga User before the name changed and it became Amiga Specific. It was a subscription-only magazine that we bagged up and posted out from the office. All the Amiga content from CCI was duplicated in AUI. I was staff writer for both magazines for a few years, and then eventually CCI ceased production. Everything there was done on a shoestring. There was a month or two when I didn't get paid because the magazines weren't making enough money, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Then the company was bought out by the Mirror Group, who owned the Mirror newspaper, and we were moved down the road a bit to share one of the Mirror Group offices. The vibe had changed by then, and I left soon after. In late... Oh, there's a picture here of Horgan's Hints. Save me cutting this in with some editing later. Horgan's Hints was a tips page that I initiated after twisting the editor's arm for about what seemed like a year. Because we desperately needed something like pokes and tips and stuff, so that was good fun. So the next question is, in late 1992 you started on CU Amiga. At this time it was starting to go through some changes and getting close to shedding its heavy games focus. One of your early roles was staff writer. Can you remember how this job came about? So my answer is Nick Veach was technical editor at CU Amiga at the time. Nick, as many of you will know, went on to become editor of Amiga Format. I knew Nick from a year or two beforehand when he and John Kennedy had done some freelance work for Amiga User International. I left AUI after a misunderstanding about, makes me laugh just reading, a misunderstanding about whether I was going to cover the European Computer Trade Show, also known as ECTS, or whether I was going on a tour of Europe in my camper van. I thought the understanding was that I was going to have a holiday. And the understanding of Anthony Jacobson, the editor and kind of boss of the magazines, was that he didn't think I was going to go on a holiday and thought I was going to cover the ECTS show. So anyway, I went to Europe and was unemployed upon my return. So that's how I left Commodore Computing International and Amiga User International. Nick kindly offered me some regular freelance writing about music in CU Amiga. Sometime later, CU needed to hire three staff writers at once. That's how big the Amiga was at the time. I was already a trusted freelancer with many years of experience and got one of those 3 jobs quite easily. I even specified in the interview that I'd take the job on the condition that I wouldn't have to do any game reviews, as I wanted to branch out. So I was quite cheeky then and quite confident I was going to get the job. I was laying out the terms, saying I'm not going to do any game reviews, I'll take the job, but I just want to do all the other stuff. Because it was true. Anyway, fortunately, they went with that. So, because at CCI and AUI, I hadn't been allowed to write anything else. Okay, next question. CU Amiga soon became a go-to magazine for the serious Amiga user. Obviously, Amiga Format was the main rival. How did you try and make the tech side of CU stand out? So this is my answer. I've got the Spaceballs 9 Fingers demo on for you, which I shall play as I answer this question. I was an enthusiastic youth immersing myself in the spangly underworld of rave culture, the remnants of which you can see strewn around me now. The Amiga had it all: sound, graphics, video, and I wanted to show people, especially skint young people, how to use the Amiga to do amazing things. It wasn't about listing specifications, it was about demystifying the technology to allow people to use it and enjoy it in creative ways. It was unique in being able to output video that could be used on a TV or recorded on VHS. PCs couldn't do that. And there was so much that could be done in terms of audio, visual art and music. Okay, next question. Back to me. Among the many Amiga models available, there was the CD32, Commodore's attempt at a console. The machine is regarded as a flop, but do you have any memories of it? Well, I answer, I never thought the CD32 would succeed. It was based on the A1200 hardware, which was already behind the curve as a games machine, both technically and in terms of support from developers. Adding mass storage and media streaming to it wouldn't help that. Although the official CU Amiga editorial line was that the CD32 was great. Myself and other members of the team got to have our say in the September 93 issue, and we were quite honest about its shortcomings. It annoyed me that aside from that, the magazine's message was that the CD32 was the great saviour that was going to trump Sega and Nintendo. Next question. You moved up to editor of CU Amiga in late 1996. Obviously you had the passion, experience and knowledge of the Amiga. That year was probably the last commercial year for the Amiga. How did you see this new challenge? Well, I respond, I could have made a move for the editor's job sooner, but I enjoyed the creative side of things and didn't want to get bogged down with management. When I did take over, my aim was to improve the magazine's branding, make its message much clearer, and shift to a more practical tutorial focus. CU Amiga's branding had been inconsistent for a few years and I wanted to fix that. Next question. Towards the end of CU Amiga, you featured the likes of Quake and Myst. To see games like this run on the Amiga, granted upgraded ones, must have been great, or was it more a case of believing the PC was the way forward? Well, I answer. PCs were way ahead of the Amiga by then, especially for 3D games. The Amiga's bitplane technology meant that in order to draw one unique pixel rather than scroll a 2D background, it had to write multiple values to the screen memory. PCs were using a byte per pixel system, just set each pixel to a single byte value, and the Amiga couldn't keep up because it had to do so much more work to define each pixel. It was good to see Quake on the Amiga, but it still needed a fully maxed out Amiga to play reasonably. And even then, it was nowhere near what you'd expect from the PC version. At that time, we at EMAP, we had shared open plan offices with a lot of console magazines and PC magazines, and there was a lot of network Quake, deathmatch Quake kind of stuff going on. It was very clear to me, what the state of the art was with gaming, with PC gaming, 3D stuff, and also with the consoles, with the PlayStation, the original PlayStation, and Sega Saturn, and that kind of thing. So it was good to see Quake on the Amiga, but it was hard to be too excited when you could see it was so much inferior to the version that was running right there on the desk next to me, where someone else was playing it on a modern PC or a Mac. So that's that. CU Amiga had some brilliant cover discs and CDs over the years. How hard was it to compile the contents for the disc, especially the CDs? Do you have any favourite games, programs or utilities that made it on? So my response, there's a picture of video tracker here. Video tracker covered it. The sun in the image. Save me editing this later on. Right. It was easier when we had discs rather than CDs. We had a budget of about £5,000 to get big applications on the discs, and we could push and pull the budget a bit from month to month depending on what was available. For example, if we knew we wanted something that would cost more for the December issue, which was usually the biggest issue of the year and the biggest seller, we might spend almost 2 months' budget on that and much less on the January issue. The logic behind that was, if you've got an issue that's going to sell, basically like a good cover mount or a promotion would boost the sales, not by an absolute number, but would boost the sales by a percentage of what that regular sale would be. So if the regular sale of the December issue was, let's say, 50,000 copies, then a good cover disc, a good application might add 10% or 20% to that 50,000. But the issue that came out in January was always the lowest seller of the year. So if we put lots of money into a promotion for that, it wouldn't add on another 7,000 or 8,000 sales to that issue. It would only add on maybe another say 10-15% of what you would expect that January issue to sell. But we'd still end up having to pay the same kind of amount to put that software on the cover. So it was a matter of putting the the promotional money into the issues that were going to sell more, because then you can sort of exponentially increase the sales. So that's why things like the kind of Christmas issues would have the biggest applications on them, because commercially it would make sense to do that. So from the mid-90s onwards, the big graphics packages were the most effective at boosting the sales of an issue. That was the idea. Since it was a commercial operation, I was always keen to put the best things on the cover, things that people might never see or try out. For example, Video Tracker was one of my favourite cover disk applications. Well, I've said here it was my favourite, and I guess apart from Octamed, I suppose that is true. I'd have to put Octamed in there as well. It created perfectly synchronized demo-style visuals using a sound tracker or Octamed module as a kind of time code. I must make some new videos with that now I have my Amiga back in the studio again, which I really hope to do when I get some time. When we had CDs on the cover, we still had that budget, but there was an additional expectation from the readers that the CD would be completely full of varied new content in addition to the main application or game. I have to give Matt Bettinson the credit for putting those CU CDs together. He worked very hard and pulled in loads of content, and that was a job in itself. But Matt was doing that on top of the technical editor job too. So thank you very much, Matt, for doing all of that. I'm going to pause this chunk of video and we'll be back in a moment. Hello, I'm back again. I've just put on the Fairy Tale Adventure on this. Just turn it down a bit. I've put the Fairy Tale Adventure on my Amiga here, which is one of the first games that I played. Certainly one of the early Amiga games that I played when I was at Commodore Computing International and Amiga User International. It was one of those early games that was really, for me, really showed off what the Amiga could do. It was using the mouse as a control method. It had this really big, wide open, kind of free roaming space. It had great sampled sound effects and other music. And it wasn't just rooted in necessarily the same kind of RPG gameplay and style that we were used to. It really did feel like a massive adventure where you could walk around, and at the moment it doesn't look like anything much is happening, but every now and then something will happen, and like these guys will come and probably try and kill me or something. I can't remember how to play it. There you go, I'm dead, because it was a long time ago and I haven't really played it since. But there's just a little reminder of, for me, of those Amiga days, the early Amiga days. Anyway, next question. Am I recording still? Double check. Yes, I am. Good. Let's crack on. So, can you remember how you were informed CU Amiga was closing in late 1998? I still love that Monty Python cover. What were some of your highlights from your years working on the magazine? Was there anything you learnt from Dan Slingsby and Alan Dykes on the editorial side? So Dan Slingsby and Alan Dykes were previous editors of CU Amiga. So my answer, I'd known for years that the magazine would close at some point. Magazines launching and closing was a way of life and nothing to be afraid of. I asked our publisher, Andy McVitie. The publisher is generally the person who is one up from the editor and is involved in the editorial and the advertising side of the magazines as a whole. So I asked our publisher, Andy McVitie, if he could give us some warning before closing the mag so that we could do a final issue. The standard practice was to be told halfway through an issue to just stop working and never get the chance to make a final issue. I saw that happen many times at EMAP and many other places that I've worked. It's never nice. Anyway, so I didn't want that to happen, and Andy understood and did the right thing. As for learning from others, all I was always observing and taking in what happened around me. The offices were all open plan and we got shuffled around a lot, sharing space with other mags. Nick Veach taught me a lot about the technical aspects of the Amiga, and I think Nick and I shared similar visions of what the magazine should be. It was a strange time in the early 90s, being in the centre of a money-making boom in which most people involved didn't care about the product or the customers, only the money or the kudos. But Nick and I wanted to tell people about genlocks, JPEGs, and what you could do if you pushed the hardware hard enough. So, next question. After CU Amiga, you did magazine work for Amiga Format, and then several years later, Gadget and Tech Mag stuff. How did you find this challenge? How did you find this change, as these were the final days of the Amiga in most people's eyes? It was nice to be asked to contribute some music tutorials and a column to Amiga Format after CU Amiga closed. It showed how friendly the rivalry was. I always respected Amiga Format for its consistency and quality. I worked on so many magazines over the following decade, editing Xbox magazines and freelancing on some of the biggest weeklies such as Heat, Zoo and Closer. The reviews editor job at Stuff was great. I managed to rope in some of those old contacts, including Nick, John Kennedy, Gary Cutlack, who you might know from Sega Saturn magazine and UK Resistance and PSW, and other trusted writers from the computer and video game days. Next question. How long did you spend on console mags? Did you enjoy it? Okay, I say about a year after CU Amiga closed, towards the end of 1999, I answered an advert for a production editor for a new PlayStation mag called PSW, PlayStation World. You know, I might even, thinking about it now, someone might have just given me a heads up on that. Maybe even someone I knew from EMAP. I can't remember. Anyway, heard about it, went for the job. And so when I arrived at PlayStation World in Harrow, I was pleasantly surprised to see some of the best people from the console mags at EMAP. People I'd worked alongside at CU Amiga, such as Gary Cutlack, Richard Ledbetter, Paul Davis, David Upchurch, and Tom Guys, and quite a few others, but we'd be here all day if I list the whole flannel panel. This was a new UK arm of a German publishing company, and they'd assembled a real A-team. The PS1 peak was just about to overlap with the imminent PS2, so it was a great time and place to be. I was doing a lot of the background stuff to fix up each page and make sure it was awesome in every way. Words, pictures, jokes, box outs, and trying to spot any libels and errors along the way. It was also a rare commercial outlet for my music. I created about 10 soundtracks for the cover-mounted DVD menus, using an Amiga for some of the sounds. Specifically, I used the speech synthesizer with the say command, the Amiga say command speech synthesizer, to create some kind of alien speech if you use really extreme settings like for pitch and speed, and then put in lots of nonsense and things like that, then you get some good sounds out of it. So I used the Amiga for some of those DVD menu soundtracks, and also Reason, Propellerhead Reason, which is a great bit of music software on a PC at the time. A couple of years later, we launched Xbox World in the image of PSW with additional good bits. The team was very compact, with me as managing editor, Gary Cutlack as the main writer, and Pat Garrett as the editor. We did about 9 issues, working very hard to make sure that the magazine was easily the best in its field. Then we were sold off to Future Publishing. It was a betrayal, really, I felt. But, it's what happens in publishing. But, when you've been working so hard to beat the competition, and then you just end up being sold off to them. I could come up with a football analogy that you could probably sort of fill in the football analogy yourself. Like, coming up from a lower league and challenging for the title, and then your team gets liquidated and you get absorbed by a top 3 team, and it was all for nothing. Anyway, that's roughly what happened there. So when we were at when we got bought by Future Publishing, the Xbox magazine, Pat Garrett left to do his own thing. Gary Cutlack stuck around for a while, and I got the editor's job. Did my best to turn it around for a while. There's only so much you can do when most people on the magazine don't really care about it. So I was there for about a year, made it work for me, and used it as a stepping stone to go on to better things. So, next question. As briefly mentioned earlier, you're a musician. Looking at your excellent YouTube channel, I found myself watching tutorials on various synthesizers, modulators, and more. Well, it's nice to know, Paul, that I've got you into the whole world of synthesizers and drum machines and stuff. As well as this, you've written various books on Korg equipment. How and when did this chapter begin for you? Well, yes, so I've tried not to plug stuff too much. But, for example, I have this series of books. This one is Korg Volca FM2, the very shiny expert guide by Tony Horgan. So I've got a series of those for all of the Korg Volca range, most of which in hardback and paperback from Amazon, and ebooks from Google Play Books and Apple Books. So, and I've got a generic synthesizer book coming out soon, probably going to be called How Synthesizers Work, a simple guide. It will be called something like that. It'll be really good. So if you want to get started in synthesizers, it'll be a great book that tells you all about that. So how did it start? Well, when I was at Stuff magazine, Korg started to release a few small analog synth projects. People had stopped making synths with knobs on, but this was the start of a renaissance. Korg was ahead of all the big synth companies and released a range called Volca. To make them affordable, costs were cut in many areas, including the manual. So I noticed that these great synths had incredibly basic instructions, and lots of people loved them but had no idea how they worked. Just put my phone onto silent. There we go. Yeah, so there was a big gap. So this is one of the original ones. This is a Korg Volca keys, which I don't have plugged in at the moment, but it sounds really nice. It's a nice analog synthesizer with knobs you can turn, and it's really good. So, but it comes with a really basic manual, and there's lots to say. So, so I started writing books about those. So I secured a license to create guidebooks for the series and began with ebooks, and more recently producing printed editions, mostly via Amazon. And this has led on to the production of other printed books, such as accessible colouring books and word searches. Indeed. Like this one, for example. Big, simple colouring cats edition, which is it's a colouring book, and it has big, simple pictures of cats, all sorts of different cats. So I shall explain briefly about that. What you're thinking, what's this got to do with the Amiga? Well, I'll tell you what, it's got nothing to do with the Amiga, but I was asked the question, so I'm answering. I have a son with severe learning difficulties, and that's opened my eyes to a lot of the issues around disability and accessibility. I'm fluent in a type of sign and communication called Makaton, and I was all set to become a professional tutor, a Makaton tutor. That didn't happen, but I still do it on a voluntary basis instead of creating books for a living. So the idea with the books What's Makaton? Makaton is a way of signing. It's a bit like BSL. It's a bit like signing that is used for people with hearing difficulties or who are deaf. It's different from the American system of signing, and it's also different from BSL, British Sign Language, but it's based on that. The idea of Makaton is that you just sign the main words. You don't sign everything. So if I was to say, I could say, hello, my name is Tony. So I'm signing hello, and I'm signing name, and I'm signing a T for Tony. Anyway, that's Makaton. The idea of the books is books that can be used and enjoyed by anyone with all kinds of disabilities that are not. So the books aren't just unicorns and fairies. They're not just aimed at regular 3 to 5 year olds. So they're for all ages. This one, it is quite heavy on the cute, but some of the others in the series are not as cute, but they're designed to be enjoyed by anyone of any age. And it might be sight impairment, it might be motor skills that are impaired, it could be anything. So the big thick outlines, and they're quite easy to colour, and they're very simple to see, and they're simple to colour. And you can do what you like. You could just colour that in one big colour, or you could you can fill that in as much detail as you like. Anyway, that's the idea of those books. That's available from Amazon. There's a whole series of those. So anyway, next question, because what's the time? I'm going to finish off in just a moment with various dance and rave acts, such as Urban Shakedown using the Amiga back then. We're coming back on topic now. There was a crossover into the excellent demo scene of the time. What did you think of it all? So I say discovering underground techno and all the genres around that in the early 90s was amazing. I can't describe how incredible some of those experiences were. Really was. To be able to bring that back into the Amiga scene was quite special. Talking to, hearing and watching the audio and video created by people like Urban Shakedown and Cold Cut was hugely inspiring. I'll give a quick shout out to Pete Cannon also, while we're talking about music and raves and stuff. Pete Cannon makes his music using an Amiga 1200 and channeling the spirit of the early and mid 90s jungle and breakbeat scene. Anyway, yeah, it was very inspiring to be talking to people at Urban Shakedown and Cold Cut, and I wasn't snobbish about the crossover hits. They helped me to get into the scene in the first place. Everyone needs a route into something as extreme and radical as that. I did some remixes of those tracks as public domain demos, which included The Bouncer, Name's Not Dan, You're Not Coming In. Remember that one? Maybe not. As well as The Twilight Zone by Two Unlimited, Charlie by The Prodigy, and an original one called Funky Footy Megamix, which I think is still around somewhere on the internet, which included samples I took from a VHS recording of the 1991 FA Cup semi-final, Barry Davis commentary on Gazza's free kick. So, do you have any favourite artists or bands? I tend to go for singles rather than bands, and albums. You can see singles. I'll give you a top 5 in no particular order. Jean-Michel Jarre, Pet Shop Boys, Hard Floor, Aria Rostami, Gabriel and Dresden. Gabriel and Dresden count as one choice because there's an ampersand in the middle. That means they're one thing. So that's my 5. What are you up to nowadays, and how can people follow you? I'm working for myself, fitting things around my family commitments. Nearly time for school pickup. It's mostly music, technology, books and YouTube. Now I have an Amiga back in the centre of my music studio. I've started an Amiga YouTube channel I think I'm going to put this video on the Amiga channel and my main channel, and then hopefully you might get a bit of crossover. So if you're watching this on my Amiga channel, look up my other channel, which has got loads more content. And if you're watching on my main channel, look up my Amiga channel, which has got Amiga specific stuff on. Not much of it at the moment, but we'll see what we can do about that. So in short, you can look me up on these platforms: Amazon, YouTube twice, Apple Books, Google Play Books, Facebook, Twitter at the Tony Horgan, Udemy. I've got a course on Udemy, which is a video tutorial to synthesizers. Lulu for the hardback books, the paperback books are from Amazon, and also Bandcamp. So I'll put links in the description, and I'll put links in the comments as well, because the description always seems to get hidden these days by YouTube. So I'll put lots of links in there, try and put it in a pinned post or something. Well, I think that's probably enough for now. So thank you for listening. Thank you to Amiga Addict for having me. You have been read to from Amiga Addict. I'm just trying to stop the sun shining on that too much. If this is not available in shops when you're watching this, try the Amiga Addict website. And that's it. Yeah, well, thank you very much for watching and listening, and I'll have more stuff coming up soon. Thank you. Bye bye.